It feels as if it's been ages since the release of Metroid Prime 4. There have been so many high-profile game releases on Nintendo Switch 2 that I have not had much of a chance to address this game and its reception. I covered it quite extensively pre-release, addressing my concerns with the product and the criticism it was receiving. However, upon actually playing it, I realized that Metroid Prime 4 was actually quite a bit better than Hollow Knight Silksong, and made several videos addressing this fact. However, a number of other YouTubers, including major names like Grums, had already come out and lobbied a number of strange accusations towards Metroid Prime 4. Among them was the claim that the game was casualized, that it ruined the tone and setting of Metroid, that the NPCs were annoying, and that the game as a whole was very disappointing to long-time fans. Now, I was very quick to jump on the fact that none of these people were Metroid fans. I did not see them around during the release of Metroid Dread or Samus Returns. I had a sneaking suspicion that these individuals were posers simply looking for an excuse to complain about a major Nintendo game. As it turns out, I was right. None of the complaints regarding Metroid Prime 4 were true. The game was perfectly fine. It felt like a sequel to Metroid Prime 2 to me. Only you got there before all the troopers had been killed. As a fan of Metroid, I had seen Nintendo grow and develop the Galactic Federation into a rather interesting part of the lore. However, casual fans have this weird idea that the Federation doesn't matter and takes away from the core experience of the game. That is to say, the Federation existing ruins Metroid's themes of isolation. This is ridiculous for a number of reasons, but most tellingly, the idea that Metroid is about being completely alone the entire time is a concept made up by YouTube video essayists. That hasn't really been true ever. The Federation has existed since the manual of the first game, and traces of their presence can be felt everywhere, in Super from the scientist at Ceres Station to the dead guy outside of Kraid's door. In fact, the idea of a partner character in Metroid can be traced back to Metroid 2, when the baby follows you around and helps you escape the planet. The idea that Metroid has to follow a specific template and design philosophy would be extremely limiting to the creators. Part of the reason Fusion and Dread were so memorable was because they broke series conventions in notable ways, and Metroid Prime, by its very nature, was always intended to be a radical departure from the core Metroid experience. In fact, there used to be a contingent of fans who refused to consider Metroid Prime as a real Metroid game and thought it would suck. How far we've come. I have grown up seeing the same pattern play out again and again. We see gamers and YouTubers insist that they love Metroid, that they want more Metroid, that Nintendo should make more Metroid. And every time one comes out, every single time, it inevitably is mired by some inane controversy that essentially amounts to the fact that the Metroid IP is not what it is hyped up to be. For the average YouTube, Metroid is this huge AAA franchise that Nintendo has been simply neglecting, but the reality is that it is, and always has been, a relatively niche thing that only appeals to American men. It's simply not a huge seller, and never has been. But for whatever reason, the target demographic believes that Metroid is one of the biggest names in gaming. So what this means for Metroid Prime 4 is that the game did about as well as the other Metroid Prime games, and the community freaked out about it because they believed the numbers indicated that it was a massive bomb. They were expecting a huge AAA release and instead got a standard Metroid game. This means that in spite of the commonly held narrative, Metroid Prime 4 actually did very well. It was never truly expected to be a major release, but instead a smaller release for core fans. And because of the Switch 2 being such a huge success, sales for the game are much higher than expected. The issue, however, is that in this early stage people are still refusing to admit how successful Metroid Prime 4 actually is. It has already outsold Metroid Prime 2 and 3, and if it sells more than 2 million units, it will have outsold the original Metroid Prime as well, cementing it as the best-selling game in the Metroid Prime series. Considering how polarizing the game was at launch, that is quite the feat. This is interesting because of how desperate the community was to gaslight players into thinking that this game failed, and 2. Because of that failure, we would never get a new Metroid game again. Let me repeat that. People genuinely believed that we would never get another Metroid game because of this game, even though Nintendo has already confirmed that they are indeed planning sequels. Nothing about the criticism this game received made any sense at all, and I think the reality of what that means is reflected in this game's sales numbers. In spite of all of the backlash, all of the complaints, all the manufactured controversy, Metroid Prime 4 was never as despised as Metroid Other M or Metroid Prime Federation Force. The idea that Prime 4 would kill the series after receiving fairly average sales for the franchise is laughable, especially considering that Metroid Dread has recently become the best-selling entry in the series. In short, there was nothing really bad to say about Metroid Prime 4. The game itself was high quality. The sales were above average for Metroid releases, and there is no real threat of the series being cancelled because of this game's reception. Although there are a handful of people online who keep making allegations that Metroid Prime 4, or that something like Silksong was more popular or well received, the simple reality is that there are no 3D Metroid-like games that can accomplish what Metroid Prime has. The series is very distinct from other 3D games like it and virtually has no real competition. The common argument among critics is that Hollow Knight Silksong is a better game at a more affordable price. But the simple reality is that it also isn't anywhere near as technically demanding or impressive. Silksong was in development for about the same length of time as Metroid Prime 4. We will almost certainly get another Metroid game before we see another Silksong, and perhaps even the Silksong DLC. The simple fact of the matter is that even if Hollow Knight Silksong was better than Metroid Prime 4, there is no possible way that the brand could compete with Metroid long-term, for a variety of reasons. The simple fact of the matter is that no matter how well Hollow Knight sells, it will never be able to innovate and experiment the way that Nintendo first-party titles tend to do. At best, Hollow Knight games will be just more of the same while Metroid and other Nintendo first-party franchises continue to innovate and evolve. At best, something like Silksong will compete side by side with Metroid until it falls off into irrelevancy. Like Disco Elysium and Celeste before it, an indie game with a dedicated online following will collapse if there isn't any new content for the audience to consume. The audience had to wait 7 years for Silksong. How long would a potential Hollow Knight 3 take? Especially since the creators are still working on DLC. DLC that, I imagine, will not be played by the majority of players. There simply isn't that much interest in a massive game like this. I've already seen firsthand how most players have not bothered doing all of the content in the base game. The idea that they would get excited for a DLC for a game that they never even finished is laughable. And on top of all that, people are becoming increasingly aware that Hollow Knight Silksong wasn't that good anyway. In fact, 6 months later, I still see more people talking about Metroid Prime 4 than Hollow Knight Silksong. It regularly is brought up in bestseller charts, and is on track to becoming a major hit on Nintendo Switch 2. Silksong, in comparison, has fallen off and been forgotten almost immediately. There is nothing that Team Cherry can do to salvage their own mess, while Metroid is going to continue to get sequels that do better and better. Metroid Prime, it feels to me, is going through the same issue that Zelda did back in the 2000s. Gamers thought the game was this super serious thing that would get more and more ultra-realistic and casualized, but it instead focused on creating original compelling content that was radically different from the competition. The Legend of Zelda, The Wind Waker was hated when it first came out too, and these days it's a universally beloved classic. Metroid Prime 4 is cut from the same cloth. I feel as if this specific game has succeeded in establishing the Galactic Federation as their own unique faction in the setting, and has established Sylux as a genuine threat for future installments. It's exciting to me to see how Metroid is growing and changing. Whenever I see other people online complaining about how Metroid isn't exactly like it was in '88, I just kind of laugh at it. It really feels as if it has become a sort of status symbol for Nintendo fans to pretend to be Metroid players, when in actuality a lot of them stopped playing after Super if they had ever played at all. I feel as if we're reaching the point where the aging, decrepit 40-year-old boomers, who refuse to admit that Nintendo has remained relevant after the NES, are just becoming increasingly irrelevant. These people seriously believed that Metroid Prime 4 Beyond would seriously impact the future of the Metroid series, and that we wouldn't be getting any further installments. Not only is that not true, it was ridiculous to even consider it. Whatever you may think about Metroid Prime 4, there is no doubt that this is not a franchise killer by any stretch of the imagination. So then, what is the game? It certainly isn't the best title in the franchise, but it didn't have to be. The idea that this would be some groundbreaking thing was entirely pushed by the fans. Metroid Prime 4's greatest failing was that it did not live up to the expectations that it did not set to begin with. The absolute worst thing that anyone can say about Metroid Prime 4 is that it is, indeed, yet another Metroid Prime game.